Hey gang, welcome to week 10. So we've now covered 3 of the 4 P's of marketing. We've talked about product, we've talked about place, channel of distribution, and we've talked about pricing. So the next several weeks of lecture are going to be talking about promotion. Promotion includes 4 things. We have advertising, public relations, personal sales, and sales promotion. So we touched on promotion way back earlier in the course when we talked about integrated marketing campaigns and the marketing mix. And now we're going to dive a little bit deeper into some of the subsets of the promotional mix. This lecture is about public relations. So public relations, as we touched on when we covered integrated marketing campaigns, is a good strategy if you have a business with newsworthy activities. It tends to be the realm primarily of nonprofits and also companies that have some eco-groovy components to them that the media likes to cover. Companies like Patagonia, that does a lot of environmental work, and Google, which has a lot of sustainability efforts. In this side, you see on the left there the Ronald McDonald House. So here's McDonald's, which is a giant fast food company. Maybe not so good for people to eat, but then they also do some good works, some corporate social responsibility efforts through the Ronald McDonald House, and they generate good public relations off of those efforts. We also see on this slide a nonprofit, the Make-A-Wish Foundation. So again, nonprofits tend to get a lot of exposure through public relation efforts. So PR has some pros and some cons. One of the main pros, advantages of public relations as a promotional mix component is that it is free. It's free exposure for your business. Doesn't cost you anything. If the media comes out and covers your business or your event, you get free exposure. That's probably the main advantage of PR. It's also more credible. People are more likely to view it because it's not an ad. But it does come with some negatives, some cons. And the main one is that you don't have any control over if the media comes out, if they cover you, and what that's going to look like. So we'll dive into some of the additional pieces of PR here in subsequent slides. Your learning objective here, know the pros and cons of PR as a promotional strategy. I just top-lined that a little bit for you here, and we'll hit on it in more detail with the following slides. Here we go. So most large corporations, most big businesses have some type of public relations department. It might be named a communications department, or if it's a small company, a small firm, it might just be part of marketing's responsibility. So most companies have a media point person, and that person is responsible for interacting with the media. That can be in situations of crisis, like Volkswagen had Dieselgate, and Weinstein Productions had Harvey Weinstein's sexual misconduct, and his company basically went under. And there was probably a communications person that was the lead point person for communicating on behalf of the company. So it can be crisis. It can also be good works that the company does. But public relations, as you can see in this slide, has some primary responsibility. They're trying to develop goodwill for the company. They're trying to influence public opinion and improve the company's reputation. So what kind of companies tend to have a lot of PR efforts, public relations efforts? Companies that maybe don't have the best public opinion or the best reputation. So like chemical companies and gun manufacturers and oil refineries, British Petroleum, Shell Oil, those types of companies, Monsanto, GMO food, things like that. So the more unsavory the company is, cigarette companies, the more likely they have a pretty aggressive public relations department. Public relations is typically not part of a marketing degree. It's typically taught through a communications degree or even through a journalism school, but it is part of the marketing communication package. And depending upon the size of the company that you'll work in, you might actually, as a marketing person, be responsible for public relations as well. How do companies execute their public relations, their PR efforts, and how do they generate publicity for their company? Well, I mentioned that they have to have something newsworthy, something positive. That can be, hey, Target lets its employees go out in the community and work for nonprofit organizations 1 day a month. Or hey, Starbucks is giving 1% of all of its sales to these charity organizations. Or hey, look at Google with its sustainability efforts. It's completely off the energy grid with its corporate office, things of that nature. Or here's a new product that a company is launching that is not so bad for the environment or even good for the environment. All of this stuff has the goal or one of the side benefits of generating public relations exposure for the company. So here is a more official definition of public relations. So my layman's definition of public relations is advertising you pay for, public relations you pray for, because it's free. So again, you don't know if the media is going to come out and cover you or do so in a positive way. So you don't have as much control, but the coverage you do get is free. Whereas advertising, you have a lot of control over your message, but you have to pay to get it distributed. So these next two slides are just view only, but this gives you some of the responsibilities and activities that somebody in a public relations position does. And public relations has changed quite a bit given the advent of social media. So it used to be a lot of communications people within a company calling journalists, booking lunches, taking them out to lunch, trying to get them to write about their company or pick up their public service announcements and their press releases. You know, a lot of this has moved into social media, so now companies can communicate directly to their customers without needing to necessarily have the media pick up their story. We certainly have seen our president using Twitter to communicate directly to his base and kind of have to bypass the media, which oftentimes wants to cover him in a different way. So whatever side of the political spectrum you're on, you can see that the power of social media is something that this president has learned how to harness to his advantage. So the meat and potatoes document that PR professionals use to seek exposure for the company, whether it's an event they're doing or good works that they're doing, is a press release. So the press release typically has the 5 W's, which is who, what, when, where, and why. It gives the media everything they need to write their story. What's happening with the media nowadays, as you can probably imagine, newspapers are struggling for readership. Why? People are digesting their news online. And so there's not as many newspaper companies. Newspapers are struggling, so their staffs are smaller, there's less journalists. And the way a lot of news is generated, whether it's newspapers or even magazines, we're talking about print here, is these publications receive tons of press releases every day. So everybody's trying to get their news put into these publications, magazines, newspapers, even online sources like Huffington Post, etc., Wall Street Journal. And the amount of actual journalism where those journalists are going out and researching their own stories and writing those stories has been reduced. So about 80% of the news that you read about businesses in these publications, newspapers and magazines, the vast majority of it, especially if it's positive about a company, it's been generated by a press release. So it tends to be positive news about new products that they've launched, good financial performance of the company, and eco-groovy products and or good works that the company's doing in the community. Those are typically all press release generated. One of your assignments this week is to actually go find a news story that kind of smells like it's a press release generated news story. If it's positive about the company, it's most likely came from a press release. And what you're going to do is find the news story first and then do some detective work and go back and find the press release written by the company that generated that news story. So these press releases are written in a way that they're intended to look and feel and read as if it's a news story. It's got a headline. It's got some quotes as if the organization was interviewed by the news company. But these were all written by the company communications people themselves. On the previous slide, by the way, if you want to go back one slide, I put a link there for some press release examples by different industries. And you can go into most companies' websites, and if you do a search within the company website for press releases, it'll take you to a newsroom or a media relations menu section of the company, and they list all their press releases there. And you'll see big companies like go look at a Honda Corporation or a Google, and they're churning out press releases oftentimes daily. So this is a big piece of what companies do to get exposure for the stuff that they do. So to recap, public relations, used a lot by nonprofits because the media likes to cover them, and used by companies when they have groovy stuff that is a newsworthy story, which is part of the reason why companies do corporate social responsibility efforts. They want to have a good image with the public. They also know that consumers now are more environmentally concerned and want to buy from companies that at least appear to be, trying to take care of the environment and taking care of their employees. But they also are running the metrics on this, and they want to see that their PR efforts are getting them coverage. There are actually ways to measure the effectiveness of your public relation efforts. So most large companies are going to hire an outside public relations firm to handle their PR for them. They might have some in-house staff. They typically might be dealing with investor relations. That's a company spokesperson communicating with the investment community about the company's financial performance. And they might outsource through a PR firm, the day-to-day coverage of the company products and good works that they're doing. Depends on the size of the company. These public relation firms justify the fees that they charge. Typically, they have a monthly retainer, much like an advertising agency or like a law firm. These PR firms justify the charges that they charge the company by making sure that they generate more public relations value in dollars than they're charging these companies in PR firm fees. How do they do that? How do they actually measure how much public relations exposure they're getting for the company? Well, if there's a news story that's on TV, they take the length of that PR exposure and compare it to what would an advertisement cost that ran for the same amount of time on this network in this time frame, and they put a dollar value to it. If it was a print story, something in the newspaper or a magazine, they take the size of the news story and they compare that to if we were to run a print ad that was of the same size, what would that cost? And there's companies, they're called news clipping services, that actually are hired by firms, and they have these little old ladies that sit around and they clip stories out of magazines and newspapers and send them into these PR firms. So there's literally human eyeballs that are looking out for these stories. This is changing again as so much of this is migrating into the online space. So now we have bloggers and online components, and it's a little bit easier to kind of track your responses and how much coverage you're getting in the online world. But to sum it all up, public relations, free media coverage, higher engagement, it's more believable and trustworthy with customers than advertising. The negatives, you don't have any control over the PR coverage or the timing. And I'll just close by giving you an example. When I worked for Westfield Corporation as a new marketing director, one of my first jobs was at Palm Desert Town Center. And forgive me if you heard this in an earlier slide. In fact, if you did, you can just disregard this. But as a new marketing director, the previous marketing director had spent the entire marketing budget. So when I came to that shopping center, we were going into the holiday season, the most important season of the year for shopping centers, and I had no money to market the center. So the only solution I had was to come up with some public relations campaigns and hope that we would get some coverage. And the event that I came up with was called Drop In for the Holidays, and I convinced a parachute lessons company that desperately wanted to be in our center to sell parachute lessons. I gave them some retail space for free in one of our empty kiosks in exchange for having the owner of the company put on a Santa suit and be willing to jump out of an airplane. And we used that event where Santa literally dropped in from the sky and dropped in and parachuted into Palm Desert Town Center. We created a campaign called Palm Desert Town Center, Drop In for the Holidays. And Santa arrived down in his parachute, and the kids were there singing Christmas songs. And he got in a golf cart, and they drove him into the center where he could take Santa photos. And our holiday shopping season started, and we got a lot of news coverage for that special event, and we made sure that we did our Santa arrival before any of the other competing shopping centers. So lucky for me, it worked, and we got lots of coverage. But I will tell you, that day it was kind of drizzling and raining, and I don't know if any of you know anything about parachuting. I've never done it, but you can't jump when there's cloud cover. So we almost had to cancel the event. The media almost left because they ran out of time while we were waiting for the clouds to clear, but luckily the clouds parted, Santa jumped, we got our news coverage, his parachute opened, we would have got bad news coverage, and the event went off okay. But again, there's no control over PR coverage or the timing or even if it's going to be covered positively. So take those notes to heart, and you can apply that to this week's assignments that are listed here. As always, thank you for listening. Any questions, send me an email. Bye-bye.